Okay, so in Yellowbirds, did any of the characters remind you of yourself or someone you know, and how?
I thought it was interesting to see that Private Bartle and Private Murphy were different in age because Private Bartle's only 21, but Private Murphy's only 18. So that's interesting to see because we're around the same age as Private Murphy and he has no idea what he's doing in war. So I think that would be like most of us because we wouldn't understand like what to do and like we're still like kind of in high school, so it's like an interesting age.
Yeah. I think the same thing, how Murphy's 18, he also doesn't really know what he's doing. I think that can kind of relate to all of us, even though none of us are going to war. Not a lot of us know what we're doing in like our future, so we're both, Murphy and all of us are kind of confused.
Yeah.
What is the significance of the title?
Since I haven't really read that much yet, I'm not really sure, but I also think that birds are like kind of peaceful and like I think that since they're in like obviously a really hostile environment, it's kind of like contradicting itself, but I think we'll like have to read more in order to like, really determine.
Yeah, and birds are also innocent, so that can have something to do with it.
Yeah. So, and like since they're kind of lost at war, like they don't really know what they're doing. That's kind of like what a bird is, because like a bird kind of like flies around like aimlessly, like not really knowing. So that can kind of like represent them in a way.
Yeah.
Do you think that there are any characters that Private Bartle doesn't like? Of course. It's not working.
Yeah, I definitely think that because on page 17 it says, I didn't realize it then, but Sterling seemed to know exactly how hard to push the lieutenant so that discipline remained. He didn't care if we hated him. He knew it was necessary. He smiled at me and his straight white teeth reflected the early morning sun. You were saying, sir, that hopefully they'll be too scared to shoot before. The lieutenant opened his mouth to finish his thought, but Sterling continued, before we kill the Haji.
I thought that quote was like an interesting point because obviously Private Bartle like doesn't like Sterling at all because he definitely knew how to like bother the lieutenant, and I think this kind of can relate to Tim O'Brien's book about the If I Die in a Combat Zone, because Tim O'Brien really didn't like Blyton, who was the infantry leader. And like he obviously Blyton had to like be really tough on all of the trainees because he like wanted the best for them and wanted them to take war seriously and like be prepared for what they were gonna like encounter in Vietnam. So I kind of think Sterling has the same mentality as Blyton because he's just trying to prepare everyone and he's taking everything really seriously, which is really important for this kind of environment. So, do you think anything's going to happen between Private Murphy and Private Bartle? Because they seem really close in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, so I think since that they're already so close and it's just the beginning of the book, I think that they'll continue to form a strong relationship and it's just going to become stronger and stronger since they're going to be going through war together. And I think that they'll be encountering really tough things together that will obviously make them more...
have like a bigger friendship.
Yes, yeah.
Because I also think like, I'm guessing like once they leave war, they'll still have like a friendship, and I think they're just trying to like survive the war together.
Yeah.
And like get through it all without being like killed by the enemy, which is really important because having that like stable relationship with someone during war is really helpful.
Yeah, and then it says on page 4 that since they are trying to avoid death, it said that those numbers still meant something to us as what passed for fall began. Murph and I had agreed we didn't want to be the 1,000th killed. If we died later, then we died, but let that number be someone else's milestone. And this part they're talking about death and how they didn't want to die.
Yeah, and they didn't want to die together, which kind of, that like what he said is kind of, I feel like that's similar to the Hurt Locker with James because James like didn't care if he died or not, and he didn't care when he died. And obviously they do care about when they die, but not, or they care about when about dying, but they don't care about when they do die, because I think that eventually someone's gonna get hurt, and that's just the mentality that they had like when going into war.
Yeah. I have another question. What do you think will happen next to the main characters?
I kind of think that since they're surrounded by death, like obviously they're Private Bartle and Private Murphy are trying to avoid death, but since so many people are being killed by the enemy, and since it's such like a dangerous environment, I definitely think that something may happen to one of them, and the other person could be like really distraught, obviously, since they form like such a close relationship together. So I think it'd be interesting to see like if they make it together and like form this friendship throughout the book, or if like one of them is just like really missing the other and mourning over their death. So how important is the setting in the story?
So in chapter 1, the setting takes place in Al-Tafar, Iraq, and so obviously this is where war is going to take place for the main characters. And then I looked at the second chapter, and it takes place in New Jersey, and since the location changes, that it's going to be a completely different setting and environment, since in Iraq they'll be fighting a war, but New Jersey, they're not obviously going to be fighting because they're in the U.S.
Yeah, and I makes me like question if it's gonna go back in time or not, because like maybe that's where their training was, but I'm not really sure because we only read to chapter 1, but it might like go back in time, which I think would be like interesting to see like how they got to like that point of their lives, and how they like were in New Jersey and then could possibly have been in Iraq, and see what they were previous to the war.
Yeah. Are there any quotes in the book that stood out to you?
Yeah, I thought on the page 3, which carries on to page 4, one paragraph that kind of stood out to me was when it says, "Then in summer the war tried to kill us. As the heat blanched all color from the plains, the sun pressed into our skin, and the war sent its citizens rustling into the shade of white buildings. It cast a white shade on everything, like a veil over our eyes. It tried to kill us every day, but it had not succeeded. Not that our safety was preordained. We were not destined to survive. The fact is, we were not destined at all. The war would take what it could get. It was patient. It didn't care about objectives or boundaries, whether we were loved by many or not at all. While I slept that summer, the war came to me in my dreams and showed me its sole purpose, to go on, only to go on, and I knew that war would have its way." I thought this was interesting because I'd never seen like an author or like anybody describe war like this, because it kind of personalized war as if it was like a person trying to kill them, when obviously it's just like a whole event that like people are partaking in that could kill them. So I just thought that was interesting because I feel like no one has described war like that before, and it says like war came to me in my dreams, which obviously like that's just like nightmares and like other people in the war that are like causing them to have these dreams, not war itself. So I thought that was really interesting and intriguing.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you think about the structure and the style of the writing?
So after reading chapter 1, I noticed that it was in the narrative view of Bartle, who is the protagonist in the story. And also, since he's the narrator, you can draw connections to Bartle and understand his perspective and point of view, and like feel how he felt during the war, and like understand the relationships he made like with Murphy.
Yeah, and I also think like by reading it in the narrative point of view, it's also like you can see if he's like biased, which is interesting because that could like persuade the reader to like think something or like believe something that Private Bartle also believed. So you can easily be influenced when it's like a narrative writing style.
Yeah. So overall, after everything we've talked about, how do you think the story is so far?
I think it's interesting. I think it's definitely putting, it's like, obviously the Iraq war is more, and the Afghanistan war is more recent, so I think it's interesting to have, like, to read a book about a war that we were like alive for and stuff. So I don't know, I think that's interesting, and I think it's a pretty good book so far. I think we need to like read more, but I think it's interesting that we're reading a book where like a friendship is definitely forming, because obviously in Tim O'Brien he had a friendship with Eric, but they got separated, so we didn't get to see how that friendship like had progressed. What do you think? Like, do you like it so far?
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that the book is, since it's more recent with the war, and since the war is still going, or still around today, that it's definitely a interesting book to read, since it's kind of something that we can all, that these characters, and also I think that since the characters are very interesting, and that as we get farther in the book, we're going to learn more about their personalities and connect to them more, and start to understand them and kind of feel for them in the work.
And I also think that like since we like I think it's all like you have to like through their actions you have to like see what their personalities are like, and I think that through their actions we'll be able to see more of their personalities and relate to them on like a deeper level than we are now.